Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to 40 Minutes with Alexandra De Hoop Scheffer. I'm Edoardo Campanella, the Director and Chief Editor of the UniCredit Investment Institute. 2025 was the year when the Trump administration rewrote the rules of global trade. 2026 looks set to be the year when the Trump administration will redefine the very concept of national sovereignty. At such a critical juncture, I'm delighted to host today Alexandra, who is considered to be one of the most prominent voices in global affairs worldwide. Alexandra is president of the German Marshall Funds of the United States, a prominent think tank based in DC, with offices all across Europe. Its focus is primarily on the transatlantic relation, but what they produce goes well beyond the US, well beyond Europe. So it's an excellent platform to really understand what's going on around the world. So without further ado, Alexandra, welcome to UniCredit.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to join you today, and delighted to do this with you, Edoardo.
Thanks. So we will cover a lot of topics today, but I think it is inevitable to start from 1 second because my okay, there is some problem with the clicker, but anyhow, I hope we will solve it soon. Okay, in any case, I think it's, okay. I want to start from what was the big shock of 2026, that is the Venezuela operation. Basically, I would like to look at the big picture and not focus just on the event per se, but look at its systemic ramification. So, in your opinion, is the US splitting the world with China and Russia? Do you believe in this interpretation of events?
I think what we're seeing in the Trump administration's strategy is a reprioritization and an acceleration of these new American priorities. And that was specifically vivid and clear in the latest national security strategy, right, which outlines the American administration's vision on the world, on alliances, and how they integrate or not European partners in their global strategic priorities. And I think one thing that was striking with Venezuela, which you just mentioned, Eduardo, is that this was the first very early implementation of that vision that was outlined in the national security strategy, which was a ranking of the priorities. It's the Western Hemisphere, it's Indo-Pacific, you mentioned China, and then third comes Europe. And so that ranking is an indicator of, number one, the strategic mindset of this American administration. It's Venezuela first, it's the Western Hemisphere, but it's also the competition with China and the Venezuela military operation, with very much also about containing Chinese influence in Latin America. And then the big question, for me and for my colleagues at the German Marshall Fund of the United States is what role for Europe, and how can Europeans position or reposition themselves within that rebalancing of US global strategic interests.
So we will get to Europe in the second part of our interview. I would like to stick for a moment to the top two priorities that you just mentioned for the Trump administration, the Western Hemisphere and then the Indo-Pacific. So talking about the Western Hemisphere, the New Monroe Doctrine or the Donroe Doctrine, depending on how you want to call it, Latin America is a very important region for China as well. China is exposed to South America through trade, through investment, through diplomatic relation, and in a way, Venezuela embodied all of them, if you will. So do you think that Latin America might become the region where there might be a risk of great power clash between China and the US? Because we used to think about the Indo-Pacific as that type of region. Is South America now the hottest region in the world?
I think it's already the case. I mean, you look at Latin America, you look at Africa. These two regions have become chessboards for exactly what you said, Eduardo, which is the great power competition. And you see that increasingly. And it's not just about economics or China investing in critical infrastructure in both regions. It's profoundly geopolitical and geostrategic. And so one of the big reasons Trump decided to start 2026 with that military intervention in Venezuela was a lot about containing Chinese influence in Latin America. And you see similar tensions in Africa. So I would say this is already ongoing. The United States now is taking a very firm position by saying Latin America, you mentioned this Trump corollary to the Monroe Doctrine is about saying, this is America's spheres of influence, and we're not going to accept China, Russia, and other countries to interfere, which is, by the way, mission impossible. But it is a reality. And so the great power competition, specifically between US and China, are going to shape, reshape, and structure regional dynamics across the world. So that's really a reality. It's again Trump accelerating some of US policies that were slightly put on pause by his predecessors.
So talking about spheres of influence, your think tank published an important report about Taiwan a few days ago. Some people claim that what Trump did in Venezuela could legitimize a Chinese invasion of Taiwan or accelerate the process there. What are the key insights from the report you just published, and how serious is the threat from your perspective?
No, I think that's a really critical question. I myself, by the way, will be leading with my colleague Bonnie Glaser a transatlantic delegation next week to Taiwan. So I'll be spending next week in Taiwan, because I think what is really important to your question is that we make sure American and European key stakeholders at least discuss and ideally try to coordinate their policies vis-a-vis China and Taiwan. And so that will be the aim of our delegation, which will be composed of American, European CEOs and policymakers. I would say on Taiwan, war is not inevitable. We should be cautious with predictions that China is planning to invade within a few years. We've been hearing, the 2027 date as a sort of, obsession. Breaking the status quo on Taiwan will come at a huge cost for Beijing. And the Chinese leadership has to contend with a number of domestic and economic political issues, as you know. And so I think, the Venezuela, China, Taiwan comparison is difficult actually to make for many reasons. What you are seeing instead is a China that is preparing for economic coercion, blockade scenario rather than immediate invasion, because that would be costly again for China. And this is what we see in the current Chinese military exercises in the South China Sea. So I would say in the short term, miscalculation, not strategy, remains the greater risk, and relations between China and the US, but also China and many of its neighbors, Japan, the Philippines in particular, remain tensed, could easily escalate if there is some sort of accident. And so I think the big stake here is to try and avoid an unnecessary escalation and an accident. And I think it's very important, that's the role we're playing, to also have Europeans on board and partnering with the United States wherever possible in the Indo-Pacific region, because this needs to be done within the transatlantic relationship.
And also, I believe that until Taiwan remains so central and so critical to the semiconductor industry, I
Yes.
think that will be the real incentive. Also for the Trump administration, it might not have an interest in the democratization, in the democracy of the island, but certainly has interest in the semiconductor industry. That could be the incentive, just to try not to give a free pass to Beijing,
Yeah.
I guess. So,
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think the tech component of the, this is very much a geotech competition between the United States and China. It's all about, I regularly quote former Secretary of State Tony Blinken's way of describing how the US approaches China. He used to say it's not just about containing China, but it's actually how to make America run faster than China. And that truly is in the tech domain. And so you see that acceleration also in the China-US competition. And Taiwan, as you just mentioned, is a central piece of that geotech competition between the US and China. So that's why I would say the scenario planning is much more complex than what we might think of.
thanks. Now, moving to the third priority of the Trump administration, that is Europe. You mentioned the national security strategy that the administration published in December. It was a big shock for Europeans. How do you think Europe should react to such a document? Do you think we should have our own version of the Monroe Doctrine for Europe, clearly identifying our own backyard, the regions that we care, in a more targeted way compared to the approach that has characterized Europe until now? And if so, what could be a viable strategy in your opinion?
I think what Europe needs is strategic clarity about what it will defend and where it will act. And that requires Europeans to collectively get together and assess the strategic environment around them. And there's a lot of different risks in the eastern flank, southern flank, but it also requires Europeans to agree on what are the top European strategic priorities and interests today. And that is still not clear. You have a variety of perspective across the EU. I think, this must begin with a clear-eyed assessment of Europe's long-term strategic interest. That means security of Europe, number one, and Ukraine is a big piece of that. It's, of course, economic resilience and growth, but it's also political influence in its near neighborhoods, right? And this is actually what the national security strategy expects, what the US administration expects from Europeans, is to see European allies take more responsibilities over their own security interests. That's not new. It has been going on and on. Again, the Trump administration is accelerating this and asking Europeans to deliver and to deliver quick. And so there's a real speed issue that Europeans have to acknowledge get together and see how they can deliver more quickly. Then I would not advocate a European, spheres of influence doctrine or Monroe doctrine. I would think that that would be the wrong answer to the Trump's national security strategy. What I would like to see is a greater coordination among Europeans and a greater unity when it comes to engaging with the Trump administration. And the number one top issue where I think Europeans can truly accelerate and invest now in order to become a more credible strategic partner for Washington is the European industrial base, and it's the European defense tech innovation. And I'll close at that because I'm experiencing that on a daily basis. This is for me the critical area where America and European allies can actually cooperate from an industrial perspective, innovation perspective, despite the political tensions that you see at the highest level.
Yeah, probably the greatest challenge is that now the Trump administration is not just protectionism, as the Biden administration is becoming mercantilist. So the state is interfering with the affair of private companies in unprecedented ways. And this clearly creates a lot of problems for Europe because it's probably unable to compete in such a way, given the rules that characterize the continent. But what I would like to discuss with you, since you mentioned it as the first priority of a more clear national security strategy for Europe, is Ukraine. Your think tank has written a lot over the years about this topic. What's the end game, if at all, in your opinion here?
I think the more this war goes on, the more Ukraine's destiny is going to be linked to EU's destiny. What you're seeing on the ground, and your map shows it, Russia is currently not willing to accept any compromise to reach a ceasefire. Russia is slowly winning the war militarily. Their assessment is that the West will not be able to sustain its support to Ukraine financially and militarily. So gambling on, just waiting the West to get exhausted and not being able to reach or accept a negotiated settlement of the war. However, what you are seeing actually is the reverse. With the US reassessing its involvement and engagement in this war, Europeans are clearly stepping up. European financial support remains strong and has even escalated, while the United States continues to provide critical intelligence and other critical capabilities. And so what I'm actually seeing live on the Ukraine issue is not just burden sharing, it's actually increasingly responsibility sharing between the United States and Europe, and Europeans within the coalition of the willing agreeing to even potentially deploy troops on the ground if needed, right? So I think there is a sense for Europe that Ukraine is an existential issue. For the United States, where I sit now, it's less of an existential issue. For the US, China is the existential issue. However, Trump has been on a journey on Ukraine and realized that a bad peace deal in Ukraine would have ramifications and repercussions in terms of how it will be able to deal with China, and also in terms of the trust that Indo-Pacific allies place into their relationship with the United States. So there has been a realization that Ukraine is not a regional or European issue. It has global ramifications. And the fact that Europeans have been constantly engaging with the American administration on Ukraine and making sure that this critical global dimension of Ukraine is integrated within the Trump administration's strategic calculus was absolutely, absolutely critical. So for me, Ukraine, the way the Ukraine so-called peace deal will be managed will determine the US and Europeans' capacity to collaborate on many other issues. One last thing. I think it is an illusion to think that the conflict resolution for Ukraine will be a Western response. I think it will be much more diverse and global. China will have a seat at the table. Turkey will have a seat at the table. Qatar will have a seat at the table, has been playing an important, mediation role. And so I would invite, our audience also to slightly look at these issues with a more global lens, right? We are always tempted to think that the response, the outcome, the solution lies within NATO, within the West, within the US-Europe relationship. And increasingly, it is not. And you have many other players in the world that increasingly have voice in conflict resolution. And you see that as well in the Middle East. So this, I think, is something that is going to accelerate in 2026 and in the years to come, and where, again, Europeans and Americans will have to look beyond the Euro-Atlantic sphere and certainly partner with other powers that increasingly have a voice on many of these geostrategic and geoeconomic issues.
So thanks, and I wish all Europeans saw things the way you do. I think the problem with Ukraine is that many, also especially in the Trump administration, might perceive it as a global issue, but it's primarily a European issue. And this is weakening, if you want, our negotiating power with Trump when it comes to the other hot issue of the moment, that is Greenland. Yep. The US has already a military base there. It's interesting to notice that over the years, the number of military personnel from the US in Greenland has actually declined. So this is opposite to the strong interest that Trump has now for the island. Greenland is a NATO territory, so also from a security perspective could be defended collectively by NATO allies. American companies could easily have access to all the resources they want on the island. So in your opinion, what can Europeans do to assuage the Trump administration? What can they offer to Washington in order to avoid an escalation of tension there?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think Europeans are already acting in a quite, I would say this time, united and forceful way, which is, right after the White House talk that took place with J.D. Vance, Secretary of State Marco Rubio, Denmark and Greenland, they recognized that there was still a fundamental disagreement with the Trump administration over Greenland. And Denmark, along with European partners, are currently stepping up their military presence on the island in direct response to the crisis. This is a way also to, increase the cost of a potential U.S. coercive intervention in Greenland. And Danish officials, emphasized that geopolitical tensions have spread to the Arctic, right? There is a recognition within NATO that the Arctic region is becoming, as you were saying, for Latin America, one of these other hotspots for the broader geopolitical, geostrategic competition between the US, China, Russia, and others. And so what Europeans are actually doing today, as we speak, is actually deploying more military presence in Greenland in solidarity with Denmark. Sweden has confirmed deployment of military officers to the Arctic at Denmark's request. Germany, the Netherlands, Canada, France, and others. And that, to me, is actually an unprecedented show of European unity this time, facing a US threat to a NATO member's territory. The other thing I'm seeing in Washington, D.C. is also for the first time a US congressional response. There has been a bipartisan effort to specifically block any kind of military action against NATO members, specifically targeting Trump's Greenland threat. And that is also really important. So what I think should be happening, instead of escalating unnecessary tensions, because as you said, the US already has access to many strategic assets in Greenland through this 1951 agreement with Denmark. What we should be doing, and GMF has been doing this behind the scene, is co-authoring a roadmap, a transatlantic roadmap on Arctic security, right? And recognizing that, yes, there is an increasing Russian-Chinese influence in the region, but that instead of escalating tensions between transatlantic allies, we should be collaborating to address some of these joint European and American concerns.
Thanks. I have a couple more questions before we open up the floor to Q&A. One is about European politics, because the challenge for Europe right now is that two of the key countries, France and Germany, right now are politically weak, at least at the domestic level. France is one case for obvious reason, but also Merz in Germany doesn't enjoy a strong and solid majority. And we know from history that without a strong Franco-German engine, nothing happens in Europe. So what's, in your opinion, given the current political constraint, what could happen in terms of leadership at the European level to bring forward, to move forward the European project and to make sure that the continent is able to respond to the complexity of the world that we have been discussing for the last 30 minutes?
I think, the German-French tandem is not sufficient, is no longer sufficient to address all of the issues we've been discussing, both for, as you say, internal dynamics within France and Germany, but also because there is a need to broaden to larger coalitions. And actually, the coalition of the willing to address the Ukraine issue is an example of how more agile and flexible the EU has been operating. And what I really like with the coalition of the willing is that, of course, it includes a lot of EU member states, but it also includes Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and others. And so I think this is, a time where formats need to be recreated or reimagined. There needs to be more flexibility, smaller, larger coalitions. You have the E5 format, UK, Germany, France, Italy, Poland, which I think is a very good format to tackle economic, trade, but also geopolitical issue. You have the Weimar Plus format, where you have Paris, Berlin, and Warsaw cooperating, and sometimes including, Brits and others into the coalition. So I think we need to have a much more agile, flexible approach to how the EU or Europe functions. And on many of these issues, having our British colleagues on board is really important as well. Europe needs to focus on three things if it doesn't want to strategically disappear. These are three transitions. One is what I call the geopolitical transition. Europe needs to seriously step up in terms of defense capabilities, defense tech innovation, in order to take care of its, hottest spots in its closest neighborhood, number one being Ukraine, but you also have the southern flank, which continues to be an unstable neighborhood. The second thing Europeans need to do and work on is the energy transition, right? And the Ukraine war has accelerated the strategic autonomy from Russian energies. And then the third transition that Europeans need to work on is the digital transition. And when you take these three key transitions that Europeans need to accelerate and succeed, these are the three areas where Europe is most dependent vis-a-vis the United States and or China. And so Europe, again, has been consistently and still is squeezed between the two big ones, the US and China. It's never nice to be in the middle or squeezed. And so I think for Europeans, be it through coalitions of the willing, EU, you name it, the big issues are these three big issues. And what do Europeans do together to reduce their strategic dependencies vis-a-vis the US and China so that it remains an important strategic player? And again, there is a speed issue. And the Trump administration, if there's one thing, positive to take from this administration, is that he is certainly going to accelerate how Europeans manage, and implement these three simultaneous transitions.
Thanks. I believe this is a good way to conclude this first part of our conversation. I want to leave space to the Q&A, also because the first question that I read is exactly what I wanted to ask you. It is about Iran. But clearly, Iran for Europe is relevant, given not only the implication it can have on the oil market, but in general in the Middle East. What are your expectations? The question is asking, do you see the regime falling after the current revolts?
Mm-hmm. I think the next 48, 72 hours could determine whether Washington accelerates regime change or allows internal dynamics in Iran to play out over a couple of months or years. I think there are three strategic realities that are shaping this moment we are in. One is the regime is at a structural breaking point, right? But not yet broken. Iran is facing an existential crisis. And what you are seeing is regional dynamics and the US reevaluating the role it wants or doesn't want to play. And even in the past hours, it's very interesting to see how the US posture has already shifted in many ways. The second thing, and I really want to focus on the United States, is that Trump has been explicitly preparing for so-called swift, decisive military operations while keeping diplomatic channels open. However, the United States also has limited options, and might not want to be in a position to use military force at a time where it is pretty much overstretched. What's also really important to keep in mind is that the Trump administration has ordered within the Venezuela military operation, a military buildup in the Caribbean, right, in the fall. And now that leaves limits in terms of what he can actually do in the Middle East and Iran situation. The last thing I want to underline is the regional dynamics. Regional allies will not support military action, even though they would benefit from regime change in Iran. But what you're seeing behind the scenes is Israel, Iran, exchanging messages through Russian mediation. That is interesting, right? Saying that they would not preemptively attack each other. And so, yes, the US role is central, but as I was saying, many of the outcomes and diplomatic conversations are actually taking outside of the Western camp. It's taking place between Iran, Israel, Russian mediation, Gulf states. And so this is, again, a very interesting, risky period. But I think everyone at the end of the day wants to contain some of these tensions. And the Trump administration, especially the military team, would not want to get too involved in Iran. If there are military actions taken from the United States, it will be very limited, very selective in order to limit the impact of a more coercive response. So I would wrap up by saying the decision is not whether, the Iranian regime faces collapse. I think it's whether the US is going to be willing to accelerate that process or allow it to unfold in the weeks and months to come. So that's my assessment of the situation.
I have a few questions for you. The first one is on French politics, and even if you don't have a strong French accent, you are originally from Paris, so I think you can comment on this question that asks about the political situation in France and whether you believe the political instability to persist in the future, or whether the presidential election that are scheduled for next year will bring more stability and more clarity.
Yeah, well, French politics has been very turbulent over these past years. And to a big extent, what's happening in France reflects what's going on in many other countries, right? Which is the rise, of the far right. The National Rally is likely to come out strong, and the center, right? The centrist bloc is or has been chronically unable, right, to find their trajectory. The centrist traditional right had trouble getting its act together. The left is divided, and so as you look at the presidential election 2027, it's going to be a very challenging election. And a country like France. France is a country that has always tried to steer, right, the EU forward. You mentioned the French-German tandem. However, because of France's, fiscal, economic, budgetary situation, this is also undermining what France can do at the EU level. And so again, at this moment where both Germany and France are facing difficult political internal dynamics, I think it is very important for EU institutions to sometimes compensate the weaknesses of the French-German tandem. And you've seen that on the Ukraine issue, you've seen that, of course, on the COVID issue, that sometimes EU institutions have a role to play by default of a strong German-French tandem. So yes, French political dynamics is an undermining factor to the European, capacity to respond to both economic, trade, and geopolitical challenges. But again, I still believe that by enlarging coalitions of the willing within the EU, this is the only way, the only path forward to continue to preserve European resilience and Europe's capacity to manage the Ukraine crisis. That's absolutely certain.
Thanks a lot. We have 2 more minutes roughly, probably time for one more question, that is the following. Assuming Europe finds the common willingness to act in a coordinated manner, does it have the financial capability to tackle the 3 main blocks that you mentioned, defense, energy transition, and digital transition?
That's the key question, is how do you support, how do you finance these 3 transitions that need to be done simultaneously? And what you're seeing live within the EU Brussels conversation is a constant tension between the level of financing these 3 transitions. And because of the war in Ukraine, as you know, many money that was initially allocated to the energy transition, right, or to the digital transition, have been reallocated to defense and security. However, myself, working in the security and defense domain, and a believer in Europe's capacity to become a strategic actor because it just doesn't have the choice. The key is to think of this 3 transition in an interconnected way, which is that if you invest in defense capabilities, you also invest in tech innovation, and you also invest in energy transition. And so I would really, invite European colleagues to think of these 3 transitions as deeply intersecting, because if we miss these intersections and just think of it in silos, you will fail in each of these pillars. And that's how I wanted to end this this conversation with, is when you look at 2026, and I would say the 4 to 5 years to come, there are 3 things that will shape the future of the international order, and that will impact Europeans, European companies, European governments. One is you will have much more competition and less cooperation, fueled by, what you've mentioned, Eduardo, the US-China competition and the tech competition. And again, Europe finds itself stuck in the middle. So the real challenge for Europe is, how does Europe get out of its in-betweenness and becomes a player? The other thing is, I think we are in an era of strategic autonomy. Everyone is seeking to de-risk from others, especially authoritarian regimes. And again, tech is at the center of that de-risking strategy. And Europe is accelerating in that direction, which is, it is reassessing the strategic costs of being over-reliant on, let's say, Chinese critical minerals, rare earths, tech innovation, but also its over-reliance on US defense industry. And the last thing is what I just said. We are going to operate in an era of growing intersections, which is, we cannot separate trade, tech, security. It's all about economic security, national security, and at the end of the day, politics and national security will drive all other decisions. And so companies, banks, the private sector is increasingly going to be put under a heightened political pressure to position themselves increasingly on these intersections, on the geopolitics. So it's very challenging, it's very complex, but if we miss these intersections, we miss the whole array of challenges, but also opportunities that we can seize as Europeans and Americans.
So, Alexandra, I think the motto that I read in your background, the motto of your think tank, strengthening transatlantic cooperation, is more relevant than ever. I think you have a very difficult, but I'm sure also rewarding job ahead. So thanks a lot for having joined us. It was a very insightful and rich conversation.
Thank you. Thank you, Eduardo. It was a pleasure to take part in this conversation, and all the best to you as well.
Thanks a lot. Enjoy the rest of the day. Bye.
Thank you. Goodbye.